Mara left the citrus house by the door that led toward the glass walk. The warmth followed her only a few steps. At the threshold, it became lighter on her face, then gave way to the cooler air of the corridor. The change was familiar now. She did not pause, because it surprised her, only long enough to settle the citrus house door into its usual position. Not shut tight, not left wide, but open by the small measure that kept the adjoining rooms easy to pass between. Her notebook was in one hand. The ring of labeled keys rested in the pocket of her cardigan, making no more weight than it had earlier in the night. The glass walk ran in a long, straight line between the rooms. Its tiled floor held a dim reflection of the lamps, and its roof disappeared gently into the fog beyond the panes. Outside, the garden paths and low hedges had lost their edges. The fog did not press close to the glass. It simply made the farther lamps seem softer, each one surrounded by a pale, even halo. Mara had seen the corridor in daylight before beginning the shift. Then it had seemed chiefly a way between places. A practical stretch of glass, tiles, doors, and benches. At night, it had a different usefulness. The lamps along it made the conservatory easy to read from one end to the other. Behind her, the open citrus house door held a warm square of light. Farther along the corridor, the fig house doorway showed its quieter greenish light. Beyond that, the entrance hall waited in its cooler blue, visible through the inner doors as a subdued patch of color. She began the lamp check at the first bracket beside the citrus house door. The lamp had a frosted cover, clean except for a faint line of moisture along its lower edge. Mara looked at its steady light, then at the small switch plate beneath it. Nothing needed touching. The ordinary purpose of the lamps was plain. They gave anyone moving through the conservatory a clear path, and they made the rooms gentle to enter during the dark hours. With fog outside, their work seemed even simpler. They kept the glass walk from becoming a place that needed careful thought. She wrote in her notebook, "Glass walk, first lamp steady." Then she moved on. The next lamp stood above a narrow bench set against the inner wall. A folded canvas cloth lay at one end of the bench, and beside it was a shallow tray holding two empty clay pots. Mara had passed them before, without needing to know anything more about them. Tonight, in the low light, the pots looked almost the color of the tiles. Their rims were dry and unmarked. The cloth was folded neatly enough that she left it where it was. Beyond the bench, the glass walk widened a little, before continuing toward the entrance hall. The panes on either side made a pale channel through the fog. Mara stood there for a moment, allowing the rooms to arrange themselves in her mind. The citrus house was warmth and a dry brightness from the orange leaves. The fig house held a deeper green dampness. The entrance hall had the blue tiles and the plain board on the wall. None of these things was difficult to remember. They were simply becoming attached to the route she walked. Mara had thought, when she first arrived, that she would need to keep checking the labels on the doors. Now she found that the light told her enough before she reached them. The rooms did not look alike at night. Each one held its own temperature and color, its own way of receiving the lamps. She went on along the glass walk. At the midpoint, a fog lamp stood on a low iron post beside the outer panes. Its shade directed the light down over the tiles, instead of outward into the garden. Mara crouched beside it, keeping one hand on the post as she looked up through the frosted cover. The lamp was steady. Its circle reached the next section of path without leaving a dark gap at the edge. She rose and brushed her palm once against her skirt. The fog had softened the view beyond the glass, but it had not altered the familiar things close by. The nearest paving stones outside were visible. A rain barrel stood beside the wall, its curved side gray in the mist. The outline of a shrub remained where it belonged. There was nothing to attend to outside, and no reason to go through the outer door. Mara returned her attention to the corridor. A second bench stood near the entrance hall end of the walk. This one was painted dark green, with a small enamel sign fixed to the wall above it. Keep path clear. The sign was old but readable. The path was clear. Mara noted this without ceremony and continued toward the final lamp. The entrance hall received her with its familiar coolness. The dark blue tiles were darker near the outer threshold, where the fogged glass admitted only a thin gray light. The notice board hung above its narrow shelf. Mara had read the board at the beginning of the night, and the notes pinned there had not changed. One was a routine reminder about closing inner doors gently. Another listed the morning delivery window for potting soil. A third, written in Mrs. Sato's neat hand, said only, "Fog lamps checked at midnight." Mara looked at the clock above the board. It was a little past midnight now. She had not arrived at the hour in exactly the way the note named. Her first round had been elsewhere, and the lamps had waited without difficulty. Still, the instruction was ordinary and useful. She set her notebook on the shelf, took to her pencil, and added beneath the existing note, "Walk lamps checked. All steady." Her handwriting was smaller than Mrs. Sato's, but clear. She returned the pencil to the notebook's loop and stood back from the board. The new line did not make the hall feel changed. It joined the others in the plain record of work done at its proper pace. Near the switch panel, the entrance lamp made a soft reflection in the tiles. Mara checked it as she had checked the others. The light was even. The outer door was secured. The inner doors stood in their usual positions. She did not adjust anything. When she turned back toward the glass walk, the corridor no longer seemed like an unfamiliar middle distance between rooms. The fog lamps showed the way in a sequence she understood. The cooler white light of the entrance hall, the low amber pool at the midpoint, the warmer glow near the citrus house. Between them, the tiles carried each reflection in a broken line. Mara walked back at an unhurried pace. At the second bench, the path remained clear beneath the old enamel sign. At the next bench, the empty clay pots remained on their tray. At the lamp by the citrus house door, the frosted cover held its small, steady brightness. She opened the door and stepped into the citrus house. The room's warmth settled around her at once. The orange trees stood in their rows, leaves quiet in the shaded light. At the far table, the bowl still held the 3 oranges beside the lamp. The chair was tucked beneath the table. The old fruit crate remained closed where she had returned it. Mara placed her notebook squarely on the table and looked once toward the open line of the glass walk behind her. The lamps continued in the fog. Each room kept its own light and temperature. The paths were clear, the doors were settled, and the next ordinary round would be easy to begin when its time came. Mara left her notebook on the citrus house table for a moment and stood among the orange trees. The warmth there was not heavy. It settled around her in a way that made the small tasks of the room seem separate and manageable. The watering can beneath the bench, the bowl of oranges beside the lamp, the chair tucked in at the table. Through the door behind her, the glass walk remained visible as a pale length of tiles and reflections. She took the ring of keys from her cardigan pocket and looked at the labels once more. They did not need studying. The little tags had become familiar during the night, their different shapes, the faint clicking sound they made when gathered together. The ones that sat slightly crooked on its ring. Still, handling them before beginning the next round gave the work its proper order. She returned them to her pocket, picked up the notebook, and went to the door. The citrus house door was already open by its usual small measure. Mara passed through without changing it. The fog lamps continued down the glass walk in a quiet sequence. The nearest one gave the tiles a warm glow near the citrus house. Farther along, the low lamp at the midpoint made a round pool of amber light. Beyond that, the entrance hall showed through its inner doors in cooler shades of blue and white. Mara began at the first lamp again, not because she expected it to have altered, but because the round began there. The frosted cover was clear. The switch plate beneath it was dry. The lamp gave the same steady light it had given a few minutes earlier. She wrote a short line in her notebook and moved on. At the narrow bench, the folded canvas cloth was still in place. The two empty clay pots rested beside it in their shallow tray. Mara looked at the floor around the bench, then at the open stretch of tiles ahead. There was enough room to walk comfortably. Enough room for someone carrying a small crate or a watering can. Enough room to stop without standing in anyone's way. The sign by the other bench had said, "Keep path clear." She found that she liked its directness. It was not a difficult instruction, and it did not ask for more than ordinary attention. The glass panes along the outer side of the corridor held the fog in soft layers. The nearest garden stones could still be seen beyond the glass, though their edges had lost their usual precision. A low hedge was only a darker band. The rain barrel by the wall had become a curved gray shape, familiar enough that it did not need looking at twice. Mara reached the midpoint lamp and paused beside its iron post. The light fell downward, as it should, making the route between the rooms easy to follow. It did not try to brighten the whole garden. It simply showed the tiles, the benches, the doors, and the pale line of the corridor ahead. In the fog, that seemed like a sensible kind of usefulness. She set one hand on the post, then let it go. From here, the conservatory arranged itself in two directions. Behind her, the citrus house was warmer than the glass walk, with its mild gold light and the muted shapes of orange leaves. Ahead, the entrance hall was cooler and plainer. Between them were the adjoining rooms she had passed earlier, each with its own small distinction. The fig house showed a greenish shade through its door. Even from the corridor, Mara could feel the change in the air nearby. A little more moisture, a softer coolness than the citrus house. She had noticed it on her first visit without knowing whether it would stay in her memory. Now she knew it would. She walked to the fig house door and rested her hand on its handle. The door opened easily. Inside, the leaves held the lamplight in broad, dark surfaces. Their shapes made the room feel fuller than the citrus house. Though there was still a clear path between the planted beds and the wall, the air carried the clean, damp smell of soil and leaves. Mara did not need to do anything there. She looked along the path, checked that the lamp near the inner wall was steady, and noticed that the small watering can by the door stood upright on its tray. Its handle caught a thin line of light. Nothing had been left across the floor. Nothing needed moving. She wrote "Fig House," path clear, lamp steady. The words were modest, but they gave the room its place in the round. When she returned to the glass walk, she left the door as she had found it, open enough for the rooms to remain connected, without making the passage feel exposed. It was the same small adjustment she had made at the citrus house threshold. By now, it seemed less like an instruction she had been given, and more like part of the building's own preference. The next stretch of corridor led toward the entrance hall. Mara walked slowly, listening only to the ordinary sounds that belonged to her movement. The soft contact of her shoes on tile, the faint brush of her cardigan sleeve against the notebook, the small shift of keys in her pocket. The lamps did not hum loudly. The conservatory did not ask to be listened to closely. Its quietness was enough. At the second bench, the dark green paint looked nearly black beneath the lamp. The old enamel sign was still readable above it. Mara ran her eyes over the floor, found it clear, and continued. By the time she reached the entrance hall, she recognized the room before she crossed the threshold. The blue tiles had their own kind of reflection, cooler and sharper than the amber reflections in the glass walk. The notice board was a darker rectangle against the wall. The narrow shelf below it held no more than her earlier pencil marks and the settled order of things. The clock showed that only a little time had passed. Mara stood beneath it and looked toward the outer door. The glass there was gray with fog. The door remained secured. The switch panel beside it was unchanged. She checked the entrance lamp, then wrote another line beneath her earlier note. First round. Complete. All lamps steady. She read it once before closing the notebook. There was comfort in the phrase. Though it did not mean the night had been divided into anything severe or exact. It simply marked a portion of work finished. She had walked the familiar route. She had looked where she was meant to look. The lamps were doing what lamps did. The paths were clear. The rooms had remained themselves. Mara put the notebook under her arm and turned back toward the glass walk. On the return, the sequence of light seemed simpler than before. The entrance hall faded behind her into blue. The midpoint lamp offered its low amber circle. The citrus house waited ahead with its warmer glow. The fig house, when she passed it, gave back its greenish light through the open door. She understood now that the conservatory could be read at night without relying on the signs alone. The temperature changed first, then the color of the light, then the particular arrangement of leaves, tiles, benches, or shelves confirmed where she was. None of it was complicated. It was only the kind of knowledge that came from walking a place calmly and allowing it to repeat itself. At the narrow bench, she glanced at the clay pots. At the first lamp, she checked its frosted cover one more time. The light was steady. She opened the citrus house door a little farther to pass through, then returned it to its usual position. Inside, the orange trees stood quietly in their rows. The bowl held its 3 oranges. The chair remained tucked beneath the table. Mara placed her notebook beside the lamp and set one hand briefly on the back of the chair. Beyond the glass, the fog softened the garden without concealing the route through the conservatory. The lamps continued from room to room, each one making a small, dependable portion of the night easy to cross. Mara took out the keys, set them beside the notebook, and looked once around the citrus house. The first round was complete. The work ahead was ordinary. The warmth of the room, the clear path beyond the door, and the quiet light on the orange leaves gave her all she needed for the next one. Mara left the keys beside the notebook for a little while. They made a small, uneven circle on the citrus house table, their labels turned in different directions. The crooked tag rested against the others. Beside them, the notebook lay open to the page where she had written the completion of the first round. The pencil remained across the lower edge, exactly where she had set it. The room was warm enough that she did not need to keep moving. She stood by the table and looked through the open measure of the door into the glass walk. The nearest fog lamp gave the tiles their familiar honey-colored sheen. Beyond it, the corridor narrowed gently between panes of glass and the dark outlines of benches. The fog outside softened the garden to pale gray and deeper gray, but the interior route stayed plain. There was the first lamp, the narrow bench, the midpoint lamp, and then the cooler gleam of the entrance hall. Nothing about the view required close attention. Mara found that she could take it in all at once now. She picked up the notebook and keys, put the keys back into her cardigan pocket, and walked through the door. She left it at its usual opening behind her. The glass walk met her with its milder air. It was not cold, only less warm than the citrus house. Her shoes made their quiet contact with the tiles. The movement of her sleeve against the notebook kept pace with her steps. On the outer side of the corridor, moisture gathered faintly on the glass, turning the nearest lamp into a softened reflection. At the first lamp, Mara paused without needing to consult her earlier notes. Its frosted cover was clear. Its light was steady. The switch plate below was dry. She looked down the corridor and then back toward the citrus house. The orange trees were not fully visible from where she stood, but their room announced itself through the doorway. Gold light, warm air, the rounded darkness of leaves. Mara could have named it before she saw the bowl on the table or the chair beneath it. The thought pleased her in its simplicity. She wrote a brief line beneath the earlier notes. First lamp steady. Then she continued. The narrow bench appeared ahead in the small range of the lamp. Its folded canvas cloth was still neat at one end. The clay pots rested in their tray beside it. Mara checked the open tiles around them and moved on, keeping to the center of the path without thinking about it. At the midpoint, the amber lamp made its round pool of light. Its iron post was cool beneath her fingertips when she rested a hand there. She did not stay long. The light showed what it was meant to show. The clear route behind her, the route ahead, and the nearby doors where the adjoining rooms began. The fig house stood to one side, its door open by the same small measure as before. Mara knew it before she reached the handle. The light inside was greenish, softened by the broad leaves. The air just beyond the doorway carried a damp, clean smell of soil. She opened the door a little farther, stepped inside, and let it return to the comfortable position that joined the room to the corridor. The path between the planted beds and the wall remained clear. The lamp near the inner wall was steady. The watering can stood upright on its tray, its metal handle holding a narrow strip of pale light. Mara looked once along the length of the room. There was no need to compare it with the citrus house, though the difference was easy to feel. The citrus house held its warmth lightly around the orange trees. The fig house had a cooler softness, as if its leaves made shade even at night. Each room had its own way of receiving the lamps. She wrote, "Fig house, lamp steady, path clear." When she returned to the glass walk, the change in temperature happened so gradually that it was almost more like a change in color. The corridor's air was between the two rooms. Its lamps belonged neither to the green-tinted quiet of the fig house, nor to the gold warmth of the citrus house. They belonged to the movement between them. Mara continued toward the entrance hall. The second bench waited beneath its lamp, dark green nearly turned black by the hour. The enamel sign above it was still readable. Keep path clear. She smiled a little at the words. They had seemed practical when she first saw them. They remained practical now, but they had become part of the conservatory's pattern as well. A short instruction, a bench, a clean length of tiles, a lamp placed where someone walking through the fog would be glad of it. At the inner doors of the entrance hall, the light changed before Mara crossed the threshold. The blue tiles reflected a cooler brightness. The air was plainer here, without the warm scent of citrus or the damp green smell of the fig house. The notice board waited on the wall as a dark rectangle. The narrow shelf beneath it was bare except for its settled, useful surface. Above, the clock marked the middle portion of the shift without making anything of the time. Mara checked the entrance lamp and the secured outer door. Then she stood for a moment beneath the clock, holding the notebook closed against her palm. She had expected to rely on the labels attached to the keys for longer than this. They were still helpful. She liked the certainty of the small printed words and the way the ring gathered them all together. But the building had begun to offer its own labels. Blue tile and cooler light, entrance hall, amber lamps, and the open line of the corridor, glass walk, greenish shade and damp soil, fig house, gold light, orange leaves and warmth, citrus house. The discovery did not change the work. There was nothing new to arrange because of it. It simply made the route feel less like a list to remember, and more like a sequence she could recognize as she passed through it. Mara opened the notebook again and wrote, beneath the lamp checks, a small note for herself. Rooms known by light and air. She read the line once. It was not a formal entry, and it did not need to be. Still, she left it there. On the way back, she noticed the order in which the rooms returned to her. The entrance hall's blue reflections gave way to the long amber stretch of the glass walk. The midpoint lamp made its dependable circle on the tiles. At the fig house door, green light rested along the threshold, and the air carried its cool, leafy dampness into the corridor. Mara glanced in. The clear path, the upright watering can, and the steady wall lamp were exactly as she had left them. She walked on. The narrow bench came next, with the folded cloth and the two clay pots. Then the first lamp, frosted and warm. Through the door ahead, the citrus house waited with its mild golden light. Before she entered, Mara paused at the threshold. The fog pressed softly against the outside panes. Garden stones, the hedge, and the curve of the rain barrel had all become quiet shapes beyond the glass. Inside the conservatory, the lamps made a continuous path from one familiar room to another. Mara opened the citrus house door a little farther and stepped through. She returned it to its usual position with an easy touch. The orange trees stood in their rows. The bowl on the table still held 3 oranges. The chair remained tucked beneath the table, and the watering can waited beneath the bench. Mara set the notebook down beside the lamp. She took the keys from her pocket and placed them beside it. For a moment she stood still, listening only to the ordinary sounds of the room and her own settling breath. The rooms had not become different. She had only learned their evening faces, the particular warmth or coolness at a doorway, the color held by leaves or tile, the way each lamp made a small part of the conservatory easy to know. Beyond the citrus house glass, the fog lamps continued along the walk. Mara looked at them once, then at the calm arrangement of the table, chair, trees, and open door. The next round would begin where the first had begun. Until then, the work was in order. The path was clear, and the conservatory was familiar enough to meet her gently. Mara left the notebook open on the citrus house table until the pencil stopped rolling in the shallow curve of the page. The first round had settled into its lines. Lamps steady, paths clear, doors in their usual positions. Beneath those practical notes, her smaller sentence remained where she had written it. Rooms known by light and air. She did not add anything to it. The words had already done the amount of work they needed to do. The citrus house was warm around her. The nearest orange tree held a soft reflection from the lamp in its leaves, and the 3 oranges in the bowl had become a familiar part of the table. She touched one with the side of her finger as she picked up the notebook. Its skin was cool and firm. Then she put the pencil through the notebook's spine, slipped the keys into her cardigan pocket, and stood for a moment beside the open door. The glass walk was visible beyond it, in a long, amber sequence. Fog rested on the outside of the panes, pale and even. The garden beyond had lost its separate edges for the night, but the conservatory had not. The lamps along the corridor made one ordinary place after another available to the eye. The first post, the narrow bench, the midpoint, the inner doors of the entrance hall. Mara stepped through. The air changed as it always did at the threshold. It was neither the mild warmth of the orange trees, nor the cooler green quiet of the fig house. It was simply the air of the glass walk, light enough to move through without thinking of it. Her shoes made their soft, regular sound on the tiles. At the first fog lamp, she stopped. The frosted cover was dry. The light inside it held steady, warming the tiles at her feet and making a faint companion of itself in the glass. Mara checked the switch plate, then opened the notebook. She wrote, "First lamp steady." The words looked much like the ones from the earlier round. That pleased her. A record did not need to become interesting in order to be useful. She went on toward the narrow bench. The folded canvas cloth still rested at one end, its pale edge turned toward the path. 2 empty clay pots sat in their tray beside it. Mara looked at the open space around them, then at the line of tiles leading onward. Clear. She did not write that down separately. It belonged with the round as a whole, and she could see it plainly. At the midpoint lamp, the corridor widened just enough to feel like a pause in the route. Its amber light rested over the tiles, the nearby doors, and the iron post itself. Mara put her hand around the post for the briefest moment. The metal was cool as it had been before. She looked back toward the citrus house. From there, it was only a soft gold room at the end of the walk. The orange trees made rounded shadows behind the glass, and the open door showed a strip of warmth on the floor. The room did not need its label from the key ring. It was itself from this distance. Mara turned toward the fig house. The door stood open by its usual small measure. Greenish light gathered along the inner edge of the frame, and the smell of damp soil came out gently into the corridor. She pushed the door a little farther, enough to pass through, and let it settle back to the comfortable opening that kept the room joined to the walk. The fig house received her with its cooler softness. Broad leaves held the wall lamp's light in quiet patches. The planted beds ran along the room in their familiar order. The watering can stood upright on its tray, handle catching a narrow, pale shine. Nothing had shifted. Nothing needed to be moved. Mara walked once along the clear path between the beds and the wall. At the far end, she looked back. The door framed the amber corridor beyond, while the room around her remained green and dim. The difference was gentle enough that it did not divide the conservatory into separate places. It made each part easier to recognize. She returned to the doorway and wrote, "Fig house, lamp steady, path clear." Then she closed the notebook and went back to the glass walk. The fog had thickened a little on the outer panes. It did not change the corridor. The lamps still made their pools of light in the same places, and the inside surfaces of the glass stayed bright enough to show the long path ahead. Mara passed the midpoint lamp and continued to the entrance hall. The blue tiles announced themselves before she crossed the threshold. Their cooler reflection took the place of amber, and the plain air of the hall met her after the dampness of the fig house. The notice board was dark against the wall. The narrow shelf beneath it remained empty and ready for whatever someone might set there during the day. The clock above it marked another portion of the shift. Mara checked the entrance lamp first. Its glass cover was clear, and its light reached evenly across the blue floor. Then she looked at the outer door and its fastening. Everything was secure in the ordinary way, with no adjustment required. She made the entry in her notebook. Entrance hall lamp steady, outer door secure. The pencil paused above the page. Mara considered whether she ought to note the fog. It was visible from the inner doors, only as a softened brightness through the farther glass, and it had already made the outside garden less distinct. But the lamps were doing their work as intended. There was no practical reason to add a line. She tucked the pencil back through the notebook. On the return walk, the route came to her in its familiar order. Blue tile first, then the warmer corridor. The second bench waited beneath its lamp. Its dark green paint had nearly disappeared into the hour, but the shape of it was easy to know. Mara passed it without stopping. At the fig house door, she glanced in. The planted beds were quiet under their leaf-softened light. The watering can remained in place. The clear path showed from one end of the room to the other. She let the view stand as its own check and continued. The midpoint lamp made its round, dependable circle. Near the narrow bench, the folded cloth was still neat. At the first lamp, Mara paused once more. Not because she doubted it, but because the first lamp belonged to the beginning and end of this portion of the round. Its light was steady. The citrus house waited ahead with its mild golden air. Mara opened the door a little farther and stepped inside. She returned it to its usual position, with the same easy touch she had used before. The warmth reached her hands first. She put the notebook on the table beside the bowl of oranges and took the keys from her pocket. Their labels lay together in her palm, small printed names, useful and unchanged. Mara set them beside the notebook in their uneven circle. The room did not ask anything more of her. She checked the nearest lamp from where she stood. It shone through the orange leaves and across the floor. The watering can remained beneath the bench. The chair was tucked under the table. The open door gave onto the first amber section of the glass walk, where the fog lamps continued without interruption. Mara sat down for a little while. The chair was simple and firm beneath her. She rested her hands around the closed notebook and looked from the table to the trees, then through the doorway toward the corridor. The conservatory had become easier to read without becoming less itself. Warmth, coolness, blue tile, green leaves, amber light. Each part met the next part without hurry. Outside, the fog softened the garden. Inside, the path remained clear from the entrance hall to the citrus house, and the lamps kept their quiet places along it. Mara breathed in the faint scent of orange leaves and settled the notebook squarely on the table. The round was complete. The work was in order. When it was time to walk again, the familiar rooms would be waiting in their familiar light. Mara remained at the citrus house table until the warmth of the room had reached through her cardigan and settled there. The notebook lay closed beneath her hands. The keys rested beside it in their uneven ring. Each small label turned where she could read it without lifting it. Beyond the open door, the glass walk continued in amber sections. The fog lamps made the corridor visible from one end to the other, though the garden beyond the panes had become a pale, softened presence. The conservatory had its own quietness at this hour. The held warmth of the citrus house, the cooler dampness farther along the walk, the plain stillness of the entrance hall. It was simply the condition in which the lamps, the paths, and the rooms could be checked without interruption. Mara stood and slipped the keys back into her pocket. The next part of the round did not require a different route. She was glad of that. The same path, taken once more, offered a chance to see whether the first observations had held. The notebook came with her, pencil tucked through its spine. At the threshold, she paused only long enough to look at the nearest lamp through the orange leaves. Its light remained steady. Then she went out into the glass walk. The air met her with its familiar middle temperature. Behind her, the citrus house was mild and gold. Ahead, the corridor held separate pools of amber beneath the lamps. Fog gathered softly on the outer panes, making the glass look faintly silver wherever it did not carry a reflection from inside. At the first fog lamp, Mara stopped. The frosted cover was dry. The iron post was cool beneath her fingertips. She checked the switch plate, then looked down the length of the tiles. The narrow bench stood where it had stood earlier, the folded canvas cloth still resting at one end. Two empty clay pots rested in their tray beside it. She opened the notebook and wrote a short line. First lamp steady. The pencil moved easily now. There was no need to search for a better way to say it. The words belonged to the object and the task. She went on. The lamps made the fog seem gentler than it had from the citrus house table. Their light did not reach far beyond the glass, but it did not need to. It rested on the floor, the posts, the door frames, and the familiar things placed along the route. The corridor did not become strange because the garden had faded from sight. It became more clearly itself. At the narrow bench, Mara checked the clear strip of tiles beside the pots. The path was open. The canvas cloth was folded flat, its pale edge turned toward the corridor, exactly as before. She did not touch it. Looking was enough. At the midpoint lamp, she stopped again. The corridor widened slightly around the post. Amber light lay over the tiles in a circle that made the place feel like a natural pause between rooms. Mara looked first back toward the citrus house. Its doorway framed a soft yellow portion of the walk, and the nearest orange leaves showed as rounded shadows against the warm light. Then she looked toward the entrance hall. The inner doors were visible at the far end, their glass faintly reflective. Before them, the fig house doorway stood open by its usual small measure. A cooler green cast lay along the frame. Even from the midpoint, Mara could recognize the room by that color and by the mild scent moving into the corridor. She smiled at the ease of it. The rooms had not changed while she learned them. The citrus house had always been warm. The fig house had always been green and cool. The entrance hall had always held its blue tiles beneath a clearer lamp. What had changed was the amount she needed to think before knowing where she was. She placed her hand briefly on the midpoint post. Cool metal. Amber light. The open fig house door. Then she continued. Inside the fig house, the change in air came softly around her. Broad leaves held the wall lamp in quiet pieces of green and gold. The planted beds ran along their familiar sides of the room. The watering can stood upright on its tray, its handle making a narrow pale curve in the light. Mara walked the path between the beds and the wall. Nothing required her hands. The soil was undisturbed, the leaves untroubled, and the floor clear from the doorway to the far end. She let herself take in the room without treating every familiar object as a new item to be considered. The wall lamp was steady. The path was clear. The rest could remain in its ordinary order. At the far end, she turned back. From there, the open door framed the glass walk in amber. And beyond that, the citrus house made a small, warm distance at the end of the corridor. The three places fitted together from this angle: green room, amber walk, gold room. The entrance hall waited beyond the doorway in its separate blue reflection. Mara returned to the doorway and wrote, "Fig house, lamp steady, path clear." She closed the notebook and adjusted the door only enough to return it to its usual opening. The movement was small and familiar in her hand. When she stepped back into the glass walk, the door settled where it belonged. Fog still covered the outer panes, even and pale. Mara walked toward the entrance hall at an unhurried pace. The second bench stood beneath its lamp, its dark green paint deepened by the hour. Above it, the old enamel sign remained pale enough to read. The path beside the bench was clear. Beyond it, the inner doors of the entrance hall showed their faint reflections. The hall received her with blue tile and cooler air. Its lamp shone evenly across the floor. The notice board remained dark against the wall, and the narrow shelf beneath it stood empty. Mara checked the outer door, and its fastening in the same plain manner as before. Everything was secure and in place. She opened the notebook. Entrance hall lamp steady. Outer door secure. For a moment, she stood beneath the hall lamp with the notebook open. The pencil rested across the page. There was no additional note to make. The fog was no more than weather, soft against the distant glass. The corridor was lit. The rooms were as they should be. She tucked the pencils inside through the notebook and began the return. Blue tile gave way to amber tile at the inner doors. The change was visible before it was felt. Mara noticed it without needing to name it. The glass walk was the space between the warmer and cooler rooms, carrying its own lightness of air and its long, clear line of lamps. She passed the second bench first. Its dark green surface remained quiet beneath the lamp, and the path below the enamel sign was still open. Then she looked through the fig house doorway. The broad leaves held their greenish light. The watering can stood on its tray. The room was complete without another entry or another turn through its path. Mara continued. At the midpoint lamp, the dependable amber circle lay across the tiles. The cool iron post remained at the edge of the path, marking the familiar pause between the fig house and the warmer end of the corridor. At the narrow bench, the pale edge of the canvas cloth showed in the lamp's light. The pots remained beside it in their shallow tray. At the first lamp, Mara paused as she had at the beginning of the round. The frosted cover was dry. The light held steady. Mara did not take out the notebook. The earlier line was sufficient, and the lamp's constancy was clear to her eyes. The citrus house door stood ahead, open by its usual amount. She pushed it a little farther, stepped through, and returned it to that same easy position behind her. Warmth met her hands. The room had not altered in her absence. The bowl of oranges sat on the table. The watering can remained beneath the bench. The chair was tucked in. The nearest lamp shone through the leaves and placed soft reflections on the floor. Mara set the notebook beside the keys. She looked once through the doorway at the glass walk. The fog lamps continued in their measured line, their light reaching from the citrus house threshold toward the entrance hall. Outside, the garden remained softened by fog. Inside, each room was available by its temperature, its color, and the ordinary objects waiting where they belonged. She sat down. The chair was firm beneath her. She rested one hand on the closed notebook and the other near the ring of keys. The route had become familiar enough that it no longer asked for much attention. Warm citrus air gave way to the first lamp, the narrow bench, the midpoint lamp, the green dampness of the fig house, the second bench, and the entrance hall with its blue tile. On the return, the same places came gently back in reverse, each where it belonged. The lamps continued in the fog. Mara let the settled room hold her for a while, calm and capable, ready for the next ordinary round. Mara remained seated at the citrus house table for a little while longer. The notebook lay closed beneath one hand. The ring of labeled keys rested beside it, their uneven circle unchanged. Across the table, the bowl still held 3 oranges beside the shaded lamp, and the chair beneath her remained firm and simple. Beyond the open door, the first fog lamp warmed a small portion of the glass walk. Nothing needed to begin at once. The round she had just completed was already recorded. The entrance lamp was steady. The outer door was secure. The fig house path was clear. The lamps along the corridor continued to cast their measured pools across the tiles. Mara had checked each part of the route, and the route had answered in the plainest possible way. Everything remained in order. She looked down at the notebook without opening it. Earlier, she had written that the rooms were known by light and air. The words had seemed like a small discovery then, something worth setting beneath the practical entries. Now even the sentence felt settled. She no longer needed to repeat it in order to remember. The conservatory had taught her its evening faces through the simple act of walking among them. The citrus house was the warmth around her hands and the mild gold light held in the orange leaves. The glass walk was the cooler air between rooms, with amber reflections broken across the tiles. The fig house was greenish shade, broad leaves, and the clean dampness of soil. The entrance hall was blue tile, clear light, and the plain stillness near the outer door. Each place remained itself. Mara had only grown familiar with the differences. She rose from the chair without hurry and pushed it back beneath the table. The legs moved softly over the floor. She picked up the notebook, slid the pencil through its spine, and returned the keys to her cardigan pocket. This would not be another full round. There was no need to begin again at every doorway or make another set of identical entries. She would walk once toward the entrance hall, looking at the lamps as she went, and then return to the citrus house. It was the final passage of this part of the shift, no more complicated than carrying the notebook from one settled place to another. At the threshold, Mara looked back across the room. The watering can remained beneath the bench. The bowl of oranges stood beside the lamp. The chair was tucked in. Warm light rested among the leaves and reached only as far as it needed to reach. She stepped into the glass walk and let the door settle at its usual small opening behind her. The change in air was gentle. The citrus warmth thinned along her sleeves, replaced by the milder temperature of the corridor. Under the first lamp, the tiles held a soft amber reflection. The frosted cover was clear, and the switch plate below it remained dry. Mara did not take out the notebook. She had already recorded the lamp. Seeing its steady light was enough. She continued toward the narrow bench. The folded canvas cloth lay at one end, its pale edge visible beneath the lamp. The 2 empty clay pots rested in their shallow tray. They did not need to be lifted, shifted, or examined. The floor beside the bench was open, leaving the path comfortably clear. Outside the panes, the fog had made the garden almost colorless. The nearest paving stones could still be seen, though their edges had softened. The low hedge was a quiet band beyond them. The rain barrel remained a curved gray shape beside the wall. Mara noticed these familiar forms without stopping. The lamps were meant for the path inside, and that was where their light remained. They did not brighten the whole garden or ask the fog to lift. They showed the tiles ahead, the edge of the bench, the doors to the adjoining rooms, and the next warm circle along the walk. At the midpoint lamp, Mara slowed. Its iron post stood where the corridor widened. The shade directed its light downward in the same dependable way as before. Amber rested over the floor and reached the next section of the route without leaving a dark space between. Mara placed her fingertips against the post. The metal was cool. She had known it would be cool before touching it, just as she had known the citrus house would be warm before leaving the table. The knowledge was not a guess now. It belonged to the root. She let her hand fall and looked toward the fig house door. Greenish light rested along the frame. Even before she reached it, the air carried a little more moisture. The doorway was open by its usual measure, joining the fig house to the corridor, without making either place feel unfinished. Mara opened it just far enough to step through. The broad leaves received the wall lamp in soft, dark patches. The planted beds kept their familiar order, and the path between them and the wall was clear. Near the door, the small watering can stood upright on its tray, its handle holding a narrow line of light. She walked only a few steps into the room. There was no reason to go to the far end again. From where she stood, she could see what she needed to see. The lamp was steady. The floor was clear. The leaves kept their quiet shapes. The soil carried its clean, damp scent. Mara rested the notebook against her palm. Earlier in the night, she might have opened it and written another line. Now the existing entry was enough. Nothing had changed since she made it. And the room did not require a second description merely because she had returned. She turned back toward the door. From inside the fig house, the glass walk appeared as a warmer strip beyond the green shade. The midpoint lamp made a low amber circle. Farther back, the citrus house was gold at the end of the corridor, its orange leaves visible only as rounded shadows. Green, amber, gold. The order was easy to hold and easier still to release. Mara stepped into the glass walk and returned the fig house door to its usual position. It settled beneath her hand without needing adjustment. She continued toward the entrance hall. Her footsteps remained even on the tiles. The keys shifted once in her pocket, then became still again. The notebook made no sound beneath her arm. Around her, the conservatory seemed quieter, not because anything had stopped, but because every ordinary thing had found its place in the hour. The second bench waited beneath its lamp. Its dark green paint looked nearly black, while the enamel sign above it remained pale enough to read. Keep path clear. The path was clear. Mara passed without pausing. There was nothing more to add to the instruction, and nothing more to do with the bench. It stood ready beside the corridor, useful in daylight and unobtrusive now. The cooler reflection of the entrance hall appeared before she reached its inner doors. Amber faded from the tiles, and blue took its place. The air became plainer, without the warmth of citrus leaves or the damp green scent of the fig house. Mara crossed the threshold. The entrance lamp shone evenly across the floor. The notice board remained a dark rectangle on the wall, and the narrow shelf beneath it was empty. Above them, the clock marked the quiet middle portion of the shift. She did not need to study the time. The outer door was secured as it had been during the last check. Its fogged glass admitted a thin gray brightness from outside. The switch panel was unchanged. Mrs. Sato's neat note remained on the board, with Mara's smaller line beneath it, stating that the walk lamps had been checked and were steady. Mara stood in front of the board and took the notebook from beneath her arm. For a moment, she considered whether a final entry was needed. She could have written the same words again. Entrance lamp steady. Outer door secure, path clear. Yet the last entry still described the hall exactly, and there was no value in making the page busier. She left the notebook closed. That, too, was part of learning the work. Knowing when a task required a mark and when the existing record remained sufficient. Mara turned away from the board. The entrance hall had offered the last point of the passage. There was no further room to inspect, and no new task waiting beyond it. The return to the citrus house would be only a return, each familiar change allowed to pass without another pause. She went back through the inner doors. Blue tile gave way to amber. The glass walk opened before her in a straight, softly lit line. The fog pressed no closer than before. It rested beyond the panes, turning the hedge, stones, and rain barrel into quiet shapes. Inside, the lamps continued at their measured intervals. Mara walked past the second bench. The enamel sign remained above it. The floor remained clear. She passed the fig house doorway. Greenish light rested across the threshold. Broad leaves held the room's dim glow, and the watering can stood on its tray. Mara felt the slight cool dampness near the door, recognized it, and continued without entering. At the midpoint lamp, she did not stop. Its amber circle moved beneath her steps and then fell behind her. The cool iron post stayed at the edge of the path. Ahead, the first lamp near the citrus house door seemed warmer because of the room beyond it. The corridor shortened gently as she walked. The narrow bench came into view. The folded canvas cloth lay at one end, and the same two empty clay pots remained in their shallow tray beside it. Their arrangement needed no final look. Mara passed them at the same easy pace. At the first lamp, she slowed only enough to take in its steady brightness. The frosted cover was clear. The switch plate was dry. The tiles beneath it reflected a muted gold. She did not touch the lamp or reach for the notebook. The check had become no more than seeing, and seeing had become part of walking. The citrus house door stood open by its usual measure. Warm air met Mara before she crossed the threshold. She pushed the door a little farther, stepped inside, and let it return to its settled position. The room received her without change. The orange trees stood in their rows. Their leaves held the shaded light without stirring. The watering can remained beneath the bench. The bowl on the table still held 3 oranges. The chair was tucked in where Mara had left it. She set the notebook on the table and took the keys from her pocket. The labels made their familiar uneven circle beside the cover. Mosser drew out the pencil, opened the notebook to the current page, and looked over the few plain lines already there. First lamp steady. Fig house, lamp steady. Path clear. Entrance hall, lamp steady. Outer door secure. Rooms known by light and air. The entries were enough. Together they held the whole portion of the shift. The lamps, the route, the room states, and the familiarity that had come from moving calmly between them. Mara placed the pencil beside the notebook and closed the cover. There was no remaining question in the work. The rooms had different temperatures because their plants needed different conditions. Their nightlights made the connecting paths easy to use. The checks kept those ordinary arrangements steady until morning. Nothing more hidden or complicated waited behind the routine. She sat down and rested her hands loosely in her lap. From the table, she could see through the partly open door into the glass walk. The nearest lamp made a warm patch on the tiles. Farther along, the midpoint lamp was a smaller amber pool. The rest of the corridor softened gradually into the fog-bright glass near the entrance hall. Mara no longer followed the route with her eyes. She let the first lamp be only the first lamp. The bench remained beside it. The midpoint waited farther on. The fig house kept its greenish shade, and the entrance hall kept its cool blue tiles. Every place was known, and none of them needed her attention again just yet. The conservatory was ready for the hours ahead. Mara remained calm and capable at the table, with the closed notebook beside the keys and the bowl of oranges beneath the shaded light. The next ordinary work would begin when its time arrived. Until then, the paths were clear, the doors were settled, and the lamps continued in the fog.